We're going to see if we can cover from this beginning of the patristic period here through St. Augustine. And then we'll probably stop and I'll be back with another one later. So we have this patristic period. I think that, after the Greeks have their influence on us, and uh, Jesus is on earth, and the beginnings of the church happens in the first century or two. Then once the church becomes established, we have the the people that are most influential for us are the people who are running the church and the people who are creating the church, because as I'm sure you know, what happens is the Catholic Church becomes uh, really the most powerful entity in the West for quite a few years, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But as that begins to happen, the people that influence our thinking a lot are the men who were the church fathers, sometimes called the patristics. Some people separate some of them from others, but don't worry about that. I don't care how you categorize them. The first one we want to mention is this guy named Tertullian. Now, Tertullian is important because he's very early. He's somebody that shows up. You can see there in about 160 or so A.D. So the early church is, not 2 centuries old yet. And so Tertullian is in on the very beginning of trying to define, trying to understand what Christianity is supposed to be, what it's going to look like, and those sorts of things. He's an interesting guy. He's comes from the heart of Rome. His dad is a Roman centurion, and he's converted to Christianity as an adult when he's in his 30s, and he marries a Christian woman and becomes a priest in the church. Tertullian is sometimes known as the angry apologist. He argued for the truth of Christianity. He argued against anyone who challenged Christianity, and he was known for being a pretty severe kind of you're all going to hell, turn and burn kind of preacher. Along with that, he really latched on to the notion that the physical parts of us were the worst parts, and he denounced anything related to physical desire, including within the marriage. He wrote at one point something to the effect of, I pray to God all the time that we would be released from this disgusting habit that we're involved in, which is a sad way to think about your physical relationship within your marriage. But he's really reflecting that sense that the physical is sinful and that the spiritual is good. It's very Platonic. So Tertullian, with all of this kind of denouncing of the physical self and denouncing of sexual desire and those sorts of things, really sets the stage for Augustine to show up and begin to kind of construct the theology of the Catholic Church around this notion that's very much comes from Plato, that the flesh is evil and the spirit is good. And we see that played out pretty significantly. So Tertullian's kind of one of the in on the beginning of that. Once the church is fairly well established, and really with the advent of Augustine, is what we might call the patristic period, where the church is dominated by these few writers and thinkers, theologians, priests, that really construct what the Roman Church is going to be for the next 1,000 years. So during this time period, Christianity is the dominant force in the West. The church controls land. The church is the wealthiest entity, more wealthy than countries and little kingdoms. Very often the church controls lots of political things, controls military. The church controls education. No one knows how to read or write. The only people that know how to read and write are trained by the church. The monks and some nuns are the only ones who know how to read and write. And if you're not taken into a monastery and taught by the church, then you don't know how to read and write. And when the church does that, they're going to teach you how to read and write using very specific things. So the church controls thinking to a really significant degree. The church fathers are primarily concerned with faith. What science has happened, that's what you would expect, right? Whatever science has happened up to this point, and there's not very much, especially 300 or 400 AD, but any of that kind of beginning of science that's come out of philosophy was really kind of disregarded and forgotten and left behind. That's why we might also call this, and it's called very often, the Dark Ages, because it's the age when everything was about spiritualism. Everything was about demons and sorcery and witchcraft and good spirits and bad spirits and all of those sorts of things. So that's why it's called the Dark Ages. And then when we have a shift later on, it becomes known as the Enlightenment. And so this is that time period where, if you watch movies or read books, if you think about King Arthur and those kinds of stories, there's always a sorcerer or a magician. Those of you who watch things like Game of Thrones and that sort of thing, there's that's kind of set in that time period where there's a lot of sorcery, a lot of magic, a lot of belief in witchcraft and demons and darkness, and then goodness and good spirits and all of those sorts of things. So this is the time when the Roman Church begins to become something, okay, and becomes kind of dominant, and as it does, we begin to see the church become a political, powerful entity that from time to time decides that it needs to get rid of non-believers and get rid of heretics and destroy those people, and that happens over time in a variety of ways. So the church fathers are really mostly concerned with faith. Okay? Philosophy and psychology were not totally disregarded, but they were kind of picked over. And basically what happened with the early theologians is that they pulled what they could use and what made sense out of philosophy and psychology, and they put that together with their theology, if it fit and if it worked. If it didn't fit very well and they couldn't make it work, then they would just discount it or discard it, not worry about it. Or they'd say, as it says there, they'd say, consider anything that didn't fit well with their faith concept, they would say, well, that's heretical. And they would totally discount it. You can see there the last thing, there's at the beginning of this period, one of the significant points in time that's important is the Council of Nicaea, which happens in 325. The Council of Nicaea was a time when the Christian church, which had been kind of loosely functioning since the time of Jesus and the apostles, we have this kind of loosely functioning church for a couple of centuries, and then we have the church kind of come together as an entity, and the doctrine is somewhat standardized, at least for that period of time. And the Council of Nicaea, a council of priests and leaders, gets together and says Christianity is the official religion of Rome. And Rome was everything. Rome was civilization. So in the West, and so Christianity becomes officially the 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 religion of the West in 325. Okay, so this is the world that Augustine steps into. Augustine's born, you can see there, around 354. So 325, the church becomes official. It becomes tied kind of inexorably uh, to the government, and the Pope becomes, and the popes during this period of time become probably the most powerful people in the West. Um, you could debate that, and who knows really, but the popes were really, really powerful during this period of time. The popes were the ones who could kind of pull the strings and manipulate the kings and queens because they had so much power and so much money and so much influence. So this is the world that Augustine is born into. Augustine is not a European. He's born in northern Africa, okay, in an area called Tagaste in northern Africa. He travels to Italy in you see in the 380s, somewhere in there, when he's I don't know, let's see, 354 to 384 will be 30, so he's like 29 years old, something like that. His father was a judge of some sort. His mother was a devout Christian woman. Her name was Monica, and she became a saint at some point. She became Saint Monica. So his father is a semi-important kind of mid-level, political, civic kind of person. And so Augustine ends up going to Italy to study in the faith, and so he goes to Milan, and he basically, up until then, and even when he goes to Italy for a while there, he lives this life of just wild, drunken fornication kind of thing. He's got many of what he calls later concubines, women that he has sex with of some sort, whether those are prostitutes or people that are, if he has this kind of harem kind of thing going on. But he obviously, based on what he writes, is living this wild, crazy life that is really kind of the furthest thing from being a devout follower of Christ at that point. You can see that I have there, he wrote in his confessions that as a young man he boiled over in his fornication. So that's a decent description of what he felt like was going on with him. Now, when he's in his 30s, he's been in Italy for a couple of years, and he's in Milan, and he has this spiritual revelation and transformation. He's under the teaching of Ambrose of Milan, and so and his mother has been a believer for a long time. So Augustine's not unfamiliar with faith. He's not unfamiliar with the ideas of Christianity, but he's neglected them, and he's not really been involved in them most of his life. So he's in a garden in Milan, and this is a legendary story. And, Augustine reports this, and it's interpreted lots of different ways, but something like this happens. He's in the garden in Milan, and he says at one point that he hears children singing a song. And it seems like it's some kind of playful song, like children in a playground might be dancing around and singing together. And he looks down on the bench where he's sitting in this garden, and there's a copy of the scripture. And so he picks it up, and he opens the scripture, and it goes to a passage in Timothy where Paul is saying that we should flee from our youthful lust. And Augustine reads this, and Augustine immediately is struck that God is speaking directly to him right that moment, telling him, turn from your wicked ways. And so Augustine does that. He does a 180-degree turn. He goes from being wild and undisciplined and having sex with lots of people and probably just partying all the time, which was probably pretty easy to do in Milan. And he goes completely the other direction. He is baptized by Ambrose. He dedicates his life to being a priest and a monk. At some point, he goes back to northern Africa and establishes a monastery there and is named the Bishop of Hippo. Hippo is the city that he's in northern Africa. So he sets up this monastery, becomes the Bishop of Hippo, and spends his life leading that monastery and being a bishop to that area. And he becomes the leading theologian for the church. He's really, really influential. Now I have some things that I think coming up here that I want to show you. This is the Duomo in Milan. If you've ever been to Milan, the Duomo is the most significant cathedral. It's the Cathedral of Milan. And it's one of the most interesting and spectacular buildings on earth. If you ever get a chance to go, you should go. If you're ever in Italy, you need to take a train to Milan and go to the Duomo. Just as an aside, you can actually ride an elevator or climb stairs if you want to, but you can ride an elevator onto the roof here. And all these spires, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these little crosses up here, and they're all over the roof. And you can actually walk all over the roof, and there are lots of places where you can get up here and you can look out over Milan and you can see for miles and miles. It's kind of cool. But I'm showing you the Duomo because it's been discovered that when you're, and this is the interior. That's the front down there, and this is back here is where the back toward us is where the front doors are. So that's the interior of the Duomo. It's kind of a spectacular place. But if you go in the front doors and you turn there, right there on the walls of the front door is this little sign which says, basically it says the baptistry of St. John, okay, San Giovanni. So this baptistry is where everyone believes that Augustine was baptized. It was built by St. Ambrose, and Ambrose was Augustine's teacher for a while, his spiritual director, and he baptized Augustine, and he probably did it here. Now this is kind of an interesting little bit of archaeology here. That baptistry, if you see where those people are walking, there's a guy in a green shirt, and to the right of him there are a couple of people walking. Well, underground right there is where this baptistry is. And this was discovered when people were doing some utility work several years ago, and they were working on the water system or electrical or something under this piazza, the plaza there, and they discovered this baptistry. And people had known that there was such a baptistry somewhere, but it was kind of discovered by accident under, right in front of the Duomo underground. And so when you go in the Duomo, now there's a staircase that goes down from inside the building down into this baptistry. And it probably had been set up like that forever and ever, but it was not discovered until fairly recently. So when you go down in there, it looks like this, and as you can see, it's been excavated. This is basic up at the top there. That's basically the top of that plaza, and then you have these series of water ducts that are carrying water into this place, and then there's a baptismal pool there, and this is where Augustine more than likely was baptized. You can see there it's kind of an octagon kind of a shape, and it's got a place there where the water flows into it, and it has other places where the water flows out. You can see there's still some of the original ceramic tile there around it in the building. This is how they think it probably looked at the time of Ambrose and Augustine. This kind of pool that had water flowing into it, and now it looks like that. Okay? So this is where Augustine was baptized, in front of the Duomo in Milan. Now, Augustine is his influence in terms of the way that we think about people and about faith, and eventually about psychology, is, as I said, really significant. Because one of the things that Augustine tries to do, the two main theologians of the Catholic Church are Augustine and then Thomas Aquinas, and both of them try to figure out how to bring together faith and reason. They've up until the time of the New Testament church emerging, the most powerful ideas in the West came from Plato and Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. The Greek influence was the strongest influence. Then the church comes along. So during this time period, what the theologians try to do is figure out, how do we reconcile our faith with all of these things that we all believe and know that we got from hundreds and hundreds of years of Greek influence? What do we do with that? Okay, so Augustine tries to reconcile faith and reason, and Augustine is very Platonic. Now we'll see later that Thomas Aquinas is very Aristotelian. Thomas Aquinas tries to pull together Aristotle's philosophy with the faith. Augustine basically adopts a Platonic view, very much like the Apostle Paul did. Okay, so Augustine tries to bring together faith and reason, but Augustine always ends up on the side of faith if there's a conflict. Okay, in one of his major pieces of writing called The City of God, he says this. He says, "Seek not to understand in order to believe, but you need to believe in order to understand." Now, those of you who come from a Protestant, especially evangelical kind of a background, this is a good Protestant evangelical theology. It even contains a little bit of that kind of disdain for too much education. Don't get too much book learning, that kind of old Baptist Assembly of God hillbilly kind of thinking that, if we send this boy off to seminary, they'll ruin his mind, and all that kind of stuff. That kind of has its roots in this kind of Augustinian thinking, that whenever there's a conflict between what we understand and faith, we always go with faith. We don't ever let that intellectual reasoning, seeking understanding, we don't ever let that have more power or more control over us than what we think is our faith. Okay, so Augustine says you need to not try to understand so that you can have faith. You need to have faith, and when you have faith, that will lead you to understanding. Now that's a real specific way to do things, and that becomes kind of a hallmark of evangelicalism. Now, later on, we're going to see that Thomas Aquinas does the opposite, and Thomistic theology, coming from Thomas Aquinas, kind of supersedes Augustinian theology within the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church kind of adopts this Thomistic approach, which kind of says you need to understand things so that you can believe well. Okay? Now, both things get mixed together in the church, both in the Catholic Church and in the Protestant Church. But a lot of hardcore fundamentalist Protestants really hang their hat on this kind of Augustinian idea, that faith is always first. So Augustine says, not everyone who thinks believes, but everyone who believes will begin to understand. So faith is always first with Augustine. when we see Aquinas, faith and intellect are a little bit closer together. They're a little bit more equal and even in their influence. But for Augustine, faith is always supreme. It's always the number one thing. Now, psychology owes some debt to Augustine because of his overall influence and how we think about a person and how we think about faith and intellect and all those sorts of things. But he actually, because these guys were not they weren't pigeonholed. They weren't just trying to do one tiny little thing. They were thinking about big, broad ideas. What is a person? What is God? How does a person function? What is the world? What is truth? All of those kinds of things were part of what they were working on all the time. So it wasn't unusual at all for them to think about things that now sound very much like psychology. So Augustine gives us some of those. For example, Augustine writes at one point, he says, too much bile can make someone irritable. But likewise, a person made irritable by external events can produce too much bile. Now, bile is technically, bile is your gastric juices, right? The stuff that's in your digestive system with your guts and your liver and all of those things that come together to make your insides work. Okay, and there was this thought, of course, and if you ever remember studying the humors, and some Christian people have done that even within the last 50 or 60 years, you know, the notion of being phlegmatic or whatever, and I don't remember all that stuff. I think it's mostly silly, but you know, what what fluids or humors dominate you? And so one of those was bile. There's the bile, and there's the blood, and there's the phlegmatic system, and there's something else. I don't remember. So the idea was that if you were irritable and grumpy, you had too much bile in your system. You were dominated by bile. Well, Augustine, this is not, the importance here is not about the bile. The importance here is that Augustine takes a really balanced, really interesting psychological approach and says, if your body's doing something to you, it can make you irritable. But if other stuff happens to you outside of you and you become irritable, then your body's going to make too much bile. Now, this is really close to the notion that we might use. For example, we might talk about depression. And we might say, okay, there are some people who sometimes have a brain chemistry problem. Their serotonin neurons, their norepinephrine neurons in their brain are not firing enough. There's not enough of that neurotransmitter working in their brain, and then they become depressed. But likewise, a person who has someone close to them die, and then they have a financial problem, and then maybe they have an argument with their wife, can become very depressed because of those external events. And what happens is when they become depressed, those serotonin and norepinephrine neurons in their brain quit firing so often, and that those neurotransmitters are not doing their work. So we don't always know which one comes first. There are people who just get depressed out of the blue, right? And when we look at their brain chemistry, they don't have enough serotonin going on. But then there are also people who have bad things happen to them, and their brain responds to the external thing, and they're depressed. So it's really kind of an advanced idea coming from a guy, you know, in 380 or 400 AD. It's a pretty decent idea.